Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and bless us as we look at your word. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Looking at Luke, who are the main characters?
Jesus.
We got Jesus as the character. And how has Jesus been presented?
Son of Man.
Son of Man. We've been talking a lot about Son of Man. What else? Jesus is.
Yeah.
Well,
Who he is.
Possessed people say the demons say Son of God.
Okay, so the demons say Son of God. So we got Son of God, hanging around in the background. We'll see it again tonight. What else about Jesus? Who is Jesus? If he's the main character in the Gospel of Luke, tell me about it. What has Luke said? What has Luke said about it? Because we can see stuff from other places. Okay, he's teacher, healer, miracle worker. Now, good. Now, Luke, as he looks at these, what you're describing right now, there's a term that would appear that this is how Luke defines Jesus. Teacher, healer, miracle worker. That shows him to be what? What does that reveal about Jesus? He is, what title does he use? Well, very impressive. Remember, Luke has all that stuff going on at the beginning. And then Peter says, you are the Christ of God. I've seen all the stuff you've been doing. I've heard what you've been teaching. I've seen the miracles. I've seen the healing, the casting out of demons. I know you are, boom, the Christ of God. Luke defining who Jesus is. All of those activities or actions or abilities sort of for Luke is linked to Jesus being the Christ. And as soon as Peter says that, we got the gospel shifted, right? Because Jesus starts heading, all of that he's doing in Galilee, Jesus starts heading where? He starts heading to Jerusalem. And as he heads to Jerusalem, what does he start doing as he heads to Jerusalem? Says it right at the beginning when he starts making the trip. Luke tells us. What does Jesus start doing as soon as he starts moving? That's it. He starts preparing his disciples because he says, right at the beginning, he says, in Jerusalem I'm going to be
Crucified.
Yeah. Betrayed, suffer, crucified, raised, and gone. Okay? That's going to happen in Jerusalem. I'm going to Jerusalem now. I'm trying to prepare disciples. Now, as Luke is shaping this story, because remember, he's telling the story to people later. He's telling the story he's not a reporter. He's telling it, 60 years after Jesus is gone. By structuring it this way, what is Luke doing for his church? By having, as Jesus goes to Jerusalem to prepare his disciples, what is then Luke kind of doing in the way he's preparing his church for life after Jesus is gone? And he's going to continue to do it after his gospel is over, because unlike Matthew, Mark, and John, there's a second volume to Luke that he wrote, which is Acts, which talks about what the church does. So Luke and Acts are tied together. You don't see that with the other Gospels. And that sort of shapes what Luke is doing. So we've got Jesus preparing them in a lot of different ways. Now, that's Jesus, the main character. Now he's in Jerusalem. He had confrontations in the temple. We're ready to move on in the story. But we know what's going to happen to Jesus in Jerusalem. Not only do we already believe, but Luke has told us. Who else is involved in the story? So we've got Jesus as the protagonist. Who else?
Pharisees.
Okay, we got scribes and Pharisees. What about scribes and Pharisees in a sentence?
They're not that good of people.
They're not that good of people. What do they want to do? What's the goal of the scribes and the Pharisees? They want to kill Jesus. Okay, so they are the bad guys. Who else we got?
Sadducees.
Oh, okay, we got Sadducees. We got them introduced, and the Sadducees are kind of there. Why doesn't Luke pay much attention to the Sadducees? Because he doesn't. He doesn't do much with the Sadducees.
They don't play that big of a part.
What's that?
They don't play that big of a part.
They don't.
In his crucifixion.
Doesn't play a part in his crucifixion.
But they believe in no life after death.
Doesn't play a part in Luke's church. Luke's church may not even know what they are because they were centered around the temple and temple worship, and Luke's church is 20 years after the temple was destroyed. So there are no Sadducees running around. They ceased to exist when the temple was destroyed. So Luke doesn't need to deal with them because they're not a threat to his church. It's something his church couldn't identify as an enemy. They can identify scribes and Pharisees because they're the opposition. They're the folks that are dumping on Luke's church. So you got Sadducees that are sort of there. You got scribes and Pharisees that have played a major role, in the story. Who else you have?
Apostles.
You got apostles,
Crowds.
Small group, disciples, big group. They're following Jesus. Now, when you compare the disciples, we're going to see it tonight really strongly. When you compare how the disciples are presented in Luke versus Matthew and Mark, and remember, I think Luke had Mark as did Matthew. That's why when there's a difference between Mark and Matthew and Luke, that kind of causes you to think, whoa, Luke may be changing something. The disciples are portrayed in a much more positive light in Luke than they are particularly in Mark. In Mark, they're just a bunch of idiots in Mark. And we're going to see it in what we look at today. In Luke, it's a much softer. Some of the issues that the disciples had, they don't seem to have in Luke. Luke is presenting them in a more positive light, which immediately tells you that Luke sees them as more important. And when are they going to be important? The book of Acts. The book of Acts is going to be an apostle-driven book. It just is. So they're going to be the early leaders of the church. So Luke isn't going to trash them in his gospel. Mark trashes them. They don't come off looking good in Mark at all. But in Luke, they look much better. Okay, so we've got the apostles, we got the crowds that are sort of in the background. We're on the threshold. We won't see them today, but there's another group that's going to be introduced. Now, we're moving towards crucifixion, right? And crucifixion is a form of punishment used by the Romans. Okay, used by the Romans. Why wouldn't the Jews use crucifixion? Why wouldn't crucifixion be a big deal for the Jews? Or why would it be something they would avoid, in fact?
Something to do with what they believe about the soul.
Well, it has, you're right, it has to do with something they believe. And it has to do with what they believe about blood. Blood possesses life. Life is in the blood. And just touching blood makes you unclean. One of the things about crucifixion is bloody. And so the Jews wouldn't do that. In fact, the way the Jews executed was stoning, and we think stoning is in throwing stone, but that's not stoning. Stoning was when they put a heavy stone on you and you suffocated. That's the way the Jews executed you, and they did it so
there was no blood.
There was no blood. You could do it without it being bloody.
That's the way they did the witches in Salem.
Yeah, really, with the stone?
With the stones, yeah.
Well, when you think about it, because they also drowned a lot of witches,
right?
And that would be another thing you could do
no
that
blood.
wouldn't be bloody. But that's what that's the way the Jews executed. So that's a good. I didn't realize that. That's interesting. Now, what's going to be important though is Jesus is not going to be stoned. He's not going to be suffocated under a large stone. He's going to be crucified, right? Which means
don't they, in a sense, suffocate too?
Well, crucifixion, and we're gonna, as a matter of fact, and we'll talk about it next week because we'll look at crucifixion next week. The way the Romans crucified you, they worked very, very hard that they didn't suffocate. They didn't want you to suffocate, and the way they put you on the cross, and in fact. And you see it in all four Gospels. The Romans actually had an opioid, a drug, gall, that would keep you from going into shock. So they would, on the cross, they drugged you so you didn't feel quite as much pain, to reduce the pain so you didn't go into shock. Because what the Romans wanted you is they wanted you to be up there as long as possible. You were going to die. You weren't coming down. You weren't coming down. But if you went into shock and died in a few hours, then people walking by wouldn't see you hanging there. The Romans left corpses on crosses for days and days and days until birds, insects did their business. Because this was a deterrent. The Romans did this to tell the people, you mess with Rome, bad things are going to happen. Bad things are going to happen. That's a reason why some of the portrayal in like the Passion of the Christ and the scourging, Romans were really careful with scourging. They wanted to inflict pain, but they didn't want to create the possibility of somebody dying when they're being beaten. Because if you died as a result of the beating, then you weren't going to be crucified. And the Romans wanted you to be moaning on that cross until you starved to death, until bugs crawled into places you couldn't prevent them from crawling because your hands and your feet were secured. That's what the Romans wanted. They didn't want you to go fast. They wanted you to go slow because that's the deterrent. That's the deterrent. Suffering is a deterrent, not anything quick. Okay, but that's what we're going to be doing later. So yeah, they didn't want you to suffocate, but you're right. That's a problem with crucifixion because if people fell forward on a cross, it would compress the lungs and you'd suffocate. But that's why the Romans would tie you back. They'd have a rope around you so you wouldn't be able to go forward. And they also would drive nails below the wrist because here it's too easy for it just to tear. So they do it behind the joint so you couldn't come. And they'd also tie your arms because they didn't want you going forward. They give you a little seat. You sat on a little seat. You had a little footrest. So you were sitting on that because the Romans wanted you to be out there a while. That was their goal. So it was a very unpleasant way to go. Crucifixion was bad. But the Romans crucified a lot of people. 7,000 slaves along the Appian Way after the Spartacus rebellion. Romans, they were rough. Romans, they were something. Okay, so we've got all of this floating around. We want to remember that Jesus is going to die on a Roman cross, which is something the church has to explain. Because if the Jews are responsible for the death of Christ, then Jesus should have been stoned. But he wasn't. He was nailed like Stephen. Stephen was stoned. He's going to be nailed on a cross. And that's one of those things, like with the baptism, that the church has to explain. Why did Jesus die on a Roman cross? It must have meant he ticked off the Romans. If he ticked off the Romans enough for them to execute him, how can you hold the Jews responsible? That's going to be an issue. Okay, but we're not there yet. We're going into chapter 22, and we'll look at all of 22 tonight, and then 23 next week. All of it having to do with the Passion. In verse 20, at the beginning of chapter 22, what do we got going on?
The festival of unleavened bread.
Festival, or by another name, the Passover. And just to file away, Passover doesn't refer to a day. Passover refers to a meal. So the festival is unleavened bread. That's the day. The meal is the Passover. And what does the festival and what does the meal represent? On what is it based? Why did the Jews celebrate it?
Because they had to leave quickly.
Okay, when?
The doorway.
What's that?
The blood of the doorway.
Okay, the blood on the doorway had to leave quickly. Where are they leaving quickly? Egypt. Okay, getting out of Egypt, which is the defining event for the Jews. So it has to do with them leaving, right? Being freed from the Egyptians, liberation, leaving slavery. Why would it then be symbolically appropriate for Jesus' passion to be associated with Passover.
He's leaving the
Because
world.
he's leaving, and by his leaving, what's happening? We got liberation going on, right? People are being freed. So really, there's a connection between what's going to happen. Now, who is mentioned early on as we're getting ready for the festival of unleavened bread?
Satan.
Well, now hold on, Satan, for just before Satan, he mentions who in verse 2?
Chief priests.
Okay, chief priests and scribes, the bad guys, right? And Luke, just to remind us that how do they feel about Jesus?
They want to put him to
They want to put him to death. So Luke is telling them, then why haven't they put him to death before?
They're afraid of the people.
They're afraid of the people.
That believe in him.
Right, and well, the people are just there. We're going to find out the people aren't quite as focused on following Jesus as the scribes and Pharisees think. But they're afraid of the people, so they haven't acted. Now, what happens in verse 3? And we're not going to look at all of them. Okay, now we got Satan. Now, when did we see Satan before? Because we've encountered Satan, Diablos, before.
The temptations.
In the temptations. And remember in the Gospel of Luke, as opposed to Mark and Matthew, both of which have temptations, how did Luke's description of the temptations end? It was a really important one verse that's in Luke, which means not in Matthew, not in Mark, which means Luke put it in there. And he did it. It's nobody speaking. He put it in. It says Satan departed.
For a better time.
For a better time.
Another time.
For a better time. And he showed up once before with Peter. When Peter made his confession and then tried to rebuke him. Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan," because he was trying to distract him. Here Satan has shown up again. Okay? This becomes the more opportune time. Which is kind of interesting because by having Satan, and this is the only gospel where Satan enters Judas. In the Gospel of John, Judas is a thief. Right from the beginning. Judas and John is constantly doing little parentheses. He was concerned about the money because he was stealing the money. Matthew and Mark don't seem to care what his backstory is. In Luke, Satan enters Judas. Now, by having Satan enter Judas, and then Judas and what is Judas going to do? He's going to betray him. What has Luke effectively done with the betrayal? If we look at the other three, Judas betrays Jesus because Judas is evil, is a jerk, right? Is evil, is greedy, is a thief, has low moral character. He's a bad person. But in this, what has Luke done? What has Luke done?
Put it in Satan's hand.
Okay, put it in Satan's hand. We all of a sudden, this is now cosmic. What's going on is now cosmic. It's not just Judas being a bad person or being motivated. This is bigger than any of the human beings in it. If you've ever seen Jesus Christ Superstar, the way he's presented in Jesus Christ Superstar is more the way Luke presents it. That he's being driven by forces he doesn't even understand. He's doing things he doesn't understand. This is kind of what Luke is suggesting. And what does he end up doing? Okay, he ends up betraying him, and he doesn't get paid for betraying him until he's already made the decision. So it's not like he's being offered money for betrayal and he betrays. He decides to betray because it's not him deciding, it's Satan, and therefore the money comes after. Has to be part of the tradition because Matthew mentions it too. Okay, so Luke has set the scene, right? That we've already got the ball rolling. Jesus is going to be betrayed. Now, what's the next event? We got a little break. What's the next event?
Where Jesus sends
Last
them
Supper.
to get the room ready.
We go back to the day of unleavened bread, right? where this Passover lamb is going to be sacrificed. Now, it's interesting. Luke has got it on, Luke and John have this occurring on different days. Because John has it on the day that they serve the lamb. Luke has it on the day before. Has it on the day before, the day of unleavened bread. This is the day they kill the lamb that they're going to serve tomorrow. So they have it because Jesus is a sacrificial lamb in John. That's a big theme in John. So he shares lamb with his disciples. Okay, but this is the day before, day of unleavened bread, so it's not a Passover meal. It's the day before Passover. He sends them out. Who does he send out? Peter and John. Really interesting. Mark doesn't mention their names. Luke does. Because Peter and John are going to be important in the book of Acts later. What does he tell them?
Go prepare.
Okay, got to prepare this meal. He calls it Passover meal, but it really isn't, because Passover meal is the next day. And what is their response?
Where do you want
to do it? And what did Jesus do?
Tells them to go into the city, and a guy with a jug of water,
And what happens?
Follow him to the house.
Follows him. And it happens, right? Now, this is kind of deja vu all over again, right? Because we've just seen this happen. When did this happen? With the donkey and entering. So this is another example of what? What is this showing about Jesus?
he can foretell the future.
Well, yeah, that he has insight.
He knows these people
that's
are
right.
going to be there. And
Right. He has insight. This is, and again, we're kind of in this cosmic thing because it's now Satan is involved. That this is a sort of a struggle between Satan and God, good and evil. Okay. Now, what happens at the beginning of the meal? What happens at the beginning? They gathered, right?
Yeah, isn't Judas late?
Well,
Judas is late, or?
He isn't in Luke. And that's going to be really interesting with Luke. In fact, Judas isn't even, he's mentioned, but there's no mention of him even leaving in Luke, which is kind of an interesting thing. But none of that is in Luke. Right at the beginning, they're there eating, and Luke calls them apostles, right? And Jesus says that he's anxious to eat with you before I suffer. Now that's kind of a play on words, because the word Pascha means suffer. That's what the word means, Passover means. So he's kind of got a double meaning. When Jesus is talking about suffering, what is he talking about? What's he got in mind when he says crucifixion, which is coming very, very soon. Why is this meal important to Jesus? What does he say is important that makes this meal important?
What's the last time you'll eat with them before they're in the kingdom of heaven?
Okay, not going until it's fulfilled in the kingdom of heaven. Now, what is that? What is he talking about when he says not going to be eating until this is fulfilled in the kingdom of heaven?
Till he's crucified and ascends and goes to
That's
heaven.
right, and the general resurrection occurs and the dead are raised. Now, so he says that's why the meal is important. Then he takes the cup, right? And what does he do with the cup?
It says kind of the same thing.
Okay, it says the same thing about the wine in the kingdom. Now, this is kind of interesting because it's different than the other Gospels. What is a little surprising that we got the meal and we got the cup. We got two cups in the Gospel of Luke. Because as soon as he does that, in verse 19, what does Jesus do? He takes the bread and does what with it? Breaks it and says, "This is my body given for you." Now, when you hear that, now understand, part of interpreting, because the Jewish meal involves explaining what the different things are. So this is not a surprise that somebody is speaking, reading, that he's explaining what the bread that he's breaking is. it's his body, but it also sounds like what? It sounds like communion. Now, kind of interesting. If Luke's church is celebrating communion, which I believe they are, because when Paul writes, the church is celebrating communion, and Paul is writing somewhere in the 40s, so about 50 years before Luke's church. Communion must have been something that was celebrated in the early Christian church. What Luke has done is he's grounded, and the other gospel writers do the same thing, he's grounded communion in the words of Jesus himself. So what you hear when you celebrate communion is the same thing Jesus said. So, boom, we're linking it. After he says that about the bread, what does he do?
Takes the cup.
He takes the cup. Now, again, we got 2 cups, right? Because he's already taken a cup. Right? In verse 17, there was a cup. And now there's a cup in verse 20.
The one he says, take this and divide among
Is it the cup for the Messiah?
Well, and it's only in Luke. This is only in Luke.
Because I've heard that about the bread. That the bread wasn't just bread, it was reserved for the Messiah. And by taking it, there was another sign that he...
I don't know. That could be. I hadn't heard that. But it could be. In the ritual, the leader would explain what the bread meant. But I don't know. It could be something, a messianic symbol. What's interesting here is Luke is using the cup twice. Historically, did he use the cup? I don't know. Who knows? But Matthew, Mark, and John don't talk about him doing the cup first and then doing it again. But that's irrelevant. What we've got now is a ritual that's being performed that his audience is going to understand. And when he talks about the blood being poured out, what is he referring?
His blood.
Okay, he's talking about his blood. So both the bread and the cup are symbols of his death, and he's presenting it in a very ritualized way, in a way that the church is celebrating it. Okay. Now, how does the mood change in verse 21? So he's celebrated this ritual that Luke's church can understand, we can understand, because we celebrated it last week. What happens in verse 21?
He tells about someone's going to betray him.
Okay, somebody's going to betray
sitting at the table, and his hand is at the table, is in the room with him, and the hand is on the table.
And we know who it is, right?
Everybody went like this.
Who is it? It's yeah.
So their hands were on the
I got a gut feeling a lot of people were doing that. Everybody else at the table was doing that. So we already know that Judas is going to betray him, right? And what does he say? What does Jesus say about how the betrayal is related to him? What does he say about the betrayal? So somebody at this table is going to betray me. What does he say about it?
God's already decided.
This has already been decided. This has already been decided. So this is happening by divine will, but he also says what?
Woe to that
Woe to
person who betrays.
the one who is the betrayer. So we've got both divine will and human responsibility. And what do the people around the table do? What do the others do?
Not me.
It's not me. They start discussing it. But we don't have this dramatic thing that we see in the other Gospels. It's really pretty simple here. All right, what happens next? So he identifies that he's going to be betrayed. What happens next?
I couldn't understand why they went from disputing about who was going to betray and then who was going to be the greatest.
Yes.
It's like when you were talking about that, how would you go to, who's
Especially
gonna be the greatest?
since if we look at Matthew and Mark, this discussion about greatness is much earlier. I mean, much earlier. In Mark, I'm thinking we're talking about the 10th chapter of Mark. This in Mark, we're looking at chapter 14. So it's much earlier than the other. Luke chooses to take this story of the greatness and move it into this meal, into the meal Jesus is sharing. Why do you think he's doing that? in other words, how is this linked? This discussion they're having about who's the greatest, how is it linked to what Jesus has just said? Because again, Luke has a reason for putting this here. How is it linked to what Jesus said? Somebody at this table is going to betray me. And it's almost verbatim what we see in Mark and Matthew. It's just earlier in the other two. How does Luke, or what connection do you think Luke sees between this thing about greatness and what he has just said?
Does it have anything to do with Peter denying?
Well, we're going to get there.
In case Peter thinks he's the greatest, it's like, no, you
Okay,
are, 'cause
good.
you're going to deny me.
So that's certainly the link of what's going to come later. This idea of greatness is going to come later. What does he says somebody is going to betray me, right? And woe to that person. So as he's looking at these 12 people, by saying that, he's identifying one of them as
the traitor.
As a traitor. Now, in the status of the 12, where's that traitor going to stand? Top? Is he going to be the greatest of the apostles? Heck no. Where's he going to be?
The bottom of the
He's going to be the bottom of the barrel, right? So he said, one of you is the bottom of the barrel, right? One of you is going to betray me, and woe to that person. And so Luke sees it as, okay, we've identified the bottom. Now they're discussing who's going to be on top. And this isn't a surprise what Jesus says to them. As they discuss who's on top, what does Jesus begin talking about? What does he say about greatness?
Same thing he's been saying all along.
Same thing he's been saying. What has he been saying all along?
The great will be made low, the low will be made great.
Right. And who becomes the example of
Him.
he does? Because he didn't come to serve.
He's serving them.
He's coming to serve, right? And what does he say in verse 28? What does he say about the disciples? Because he said, so greatness is based on serving. But in 28, he does suggest that the apostles, remember we got 12 of them, the 12 apostles are going to play an important role. What's the role they're going to play?
They're going to stand by him.
Okay, they're going to stand, you are those who are going to stand, who have stood by me through my trials. And remember, he said that once before when he said a little bit earlier, he said about it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to go through into the kingdom of heaven. And they said, well, then who can be saved? And he says, no human being can do it, but anything is possible with God. And then they say, well, what about us? Man, we have been following you the whole way. And Jesus says, God isn't going to forget what you've done. And he's kind of reinforcing that here. The issue isn't greatness. The greatness is shown by service. But these 12 are going to be important. It doesn't say everybody is important, but these 12 are going to be important. How are they going to be important?
I'm going to judge the 12.
They're going to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. Kind of interesting. Who's sitting in that room when he says this?
Judas.
Judas is sitting in this room. Now we're going to find out that Judas is not going to be available to judge the 12 tribes, but he's going to be replaced. So Jesus in Luke certainly sees those 12 as being really, really important. Who does he turn to? Turns to Peter. And what does he say to Peter?
He's going to betray him.
Well, before he says what context, because in the other Gospels it's set up in a different way. How does Luke set it up? Because Jesus initiates. In the other Gospels, they're all just, we'll stand by you to the very end. And Jesus says, wait a minute, Jesus sets this up. How does he set it up?
He says, listen, Satan's going to sift you.
I'm going to sift you like wheat.
Separate them.
Yeah. Who's involved in this? This isn't Peter chickening out and not standing by Jesus. Satan is involved. Again, we've got, in Luke's eyes, this is a cosmic thing. Judas is being driven by Satan. Peter's going to be driven by Satan. In a way, it kind of excuses Peter a little bit, right? From what he's going to do later. Because this isn't Peter just being like he is in Mark. He doesn't want to be arrested. He's kind of scared. But in Luke, Satan is going to be involved in it, right? Because Satan is sifting all of you like grain. What has Jesus done with respect to Peter? What special thing has Jesus done for Peter?
Giving them an alibi for...
Giving him a little bit of alibi. And when you look at 32, he's even done more than that. What does Jesus say? Again, not in the other Gospels. What does he say to Peter in 32?
I pray for you.
I'm praying for you, and in particular, when you slip, you're going to come back because you got a job to do. What is going to be your job?
To betray him 3 times.
Going to betray him, but later your job is going to do what? To strengthen the brothers. You got a role to play to strengthen the brothers. And that's when Peter says, what? I'll go to prison for you. And Jesus says,
And to death.
yep. Jesus says what to him?
Oh, before the rooster crows 3 times.
Now, again, I think that's really interesting. That Luke, as he's writing this, telling this story, and this is different than the others, Peter is not only, this is something Satan is involved in doing, but Jesus says to him, now look, you're going to turn, right? But you're also going to, I'm praying that you turn back, because you got a job to do. You got to strengthen the brothers. When is Peter going to strengthen the brothers? When is Peter going to do that?
Before the rooster crows.
Well,
What is he going to strengthen?
He's going to turn. Jesus says, you're going to turn, but I'm praying that you turn back and that your faith be strengthened. When is Peter going to strengthen the brothers? And
After the crucifixion.
it's got to be after the crucifixion. So when is he going to strengthen the brothers? Remember, we got 2 volumes.
Acts.
In Acts, Peter's going to be the one who's the driver in the first 13 chapters. So Peter's going to do what Jesus said he's going to do. We don't see that in the other Gospels. In fact, when you look at Mark, Peter's kind of a jerk, but they all are, because they're all saying how great how they're going to stand. Now Jesus, again, we got a longer meeting in the other Gospels. He leaves. What happens in Luke? Verse 35, after he says, you're going to deny me. Then what does Jesus start talking? His last words in his farewell speech.
But him sending them out.
Sending them
Because they had
out.
to give everything up.
Yeah,
And he sent them out
Right.
without anything, but he took care of them.
that's right. And remember when he sent them out before, and he said, when you go to a town and they receive you, accept it. If they don't, move to the next one. If somebody takes you in for the night, stay with them. But don't take anything with you. Don't. Now what does he say?
Take a purse.
Now you need to take a purse. And you also need to take
a sword.
You also need to take a sword. And what would that, why would he be saying that now? This is the last words he has for his disciples.
They'd have to protect themselves.
They're going to have to protect themselves. Again, we got Acts. And so we're going to see that story go through Acts. We're going to see that going through Acts. For Jesus, what is about to be happening? What's about to happen?
He's going to get arrested.
He is going to be arrested. Scripture is going to be fulfilled. This is going to happen that needs to happen. And what did the disciples immediately say when Jesus says, okay, boys, Scripture is going to be fulfilled. And the apostles what do they focus on? What's there in verse 38? I love it. Jesus says, okay, Scripture's about to be fulfilled. Everything written about me is about to happen. And what did the apostles say? We got two swords. You talked about swords. We got two of them. And Jesus says,
That's enough.
you got enough. You don't need any more than two. All right. So we're ready. We're ready to move. He's finished with his disciples around the meal, but a whole lot more went on here at the meal than we see in Mark and Matthew. Not as much as John. John has a lot going on at the dinner, but not so much in Mark and John. But here we're done. Jesus again is preparing his disciples for life after he's gone. Where do they go? I want you to think about this. This is interesting what happens. He's going to the Mount of Olives, which is his custom, right? Why is he going there?
Pray.
He's going to go there and pray, and who follows him? Okay, disciples, not apostles, but disciples, which is a far broader group. And when they get to the place, what does Jesus tell them?
Stay away, pray.
Okay, he says, pray that
You don't fall into temptation.
you don't fall into temptation. Now, Donna, you said stay away. Why did you say stay away?
Because they keep falling asleep on it.
Because that's what it says in the Gospel of Mark and Matthew. He takes the smaller group with him. The disciples are there, and then he takes Peter, James, and John aside to stay with him as he prays and tells them not to fall asleep, and they do. We don't have that command here. Which means if we don't have the command and they fall asleep, they are not what? They are not disobeying it. They are not disobeying him. Like I said, Luke is going to make the disciples not quite so bad. In fact, when they do fall asleep, Luke is going to give a reason why they're falling asleep. But Jesus goes, he kneels down and prays, and what does he pray?
Take this cup from me.
If you're willing, remove this cup from me. But how does he end? How does he end it?
Your will be done.
But your will be done. And as soon as he says that, what occurs? An angel from heaven came to give him strength. And how is the prayer described?
He prayed more earnestly.
It is so earnest, it is like
His sweat turned into blood.
like drops of blood. Okay. So this is, the scene here is Jesus, the disciples are in the background, Jesus is praying this incredibly intense prayer. God's will has to be done. And we already know what God's will is because he's already said it. Now, when he gets up from praying, what does Jesus do? He goes to his disciples, right, and finds them sleeping. Now, when we look at Matthew and Mark, they're sleeping, and it says they just couldn't keep their eyes open. Here, why are they asleep?
So they're on temptation.
They are feeling so much
Grief.
They're feeling so much grief.
If I was feeling grief, I wouldn't be sleeping.
But so what we've got here, and see, this is when you start looking at it, the story in the tradition. This is what people know, that Jesus went and prayed, and his disciples fell asleep. Right? Now, if we just looked at that on the surface, Jesus is praying, his disciples fall asleep, we'd say, what about the disciples?
They were tired.
They were tired, weak, especially when Jesus says, keep awake. I mean, he's been talking about keep awake all over the place. That they're weak, bored, they don't come off looking good, right? Here, though, they fall asleep because they are overwhelmed by grief. They're feeling grief. It's harder to blame them. It's not like they're just bored or weak. They fall asleep because of grief. And in the other Gospels, how many times does Jesus go and pray and find them asleep? 3 times. He goes and prays, comes back, they're asleep. Goes, says the same thing, stay awake. Goes, prays, comes back asleep. Same thing, comes back, they're asleep. How many times does Jesus pray in Luke? One time. And they're asleep because they're feeling grief. And who is it that's asleep? The disciples. He doesn't single Peter and James out. Because he's just said that Peter's going to be important later. So again, he's kind of cushioning Peter as Luke presents him. Peter comes off looking a little better than he does in the Gospel of Mark. They don't look weak. In fact, what happens while Jesus is speaking to him? Get up and pray that you won't come into a time of trial or temptation, because his trial is coming up, right? What happens when he's still speaking?
Judas comes.
Judas comes. And Luke reminds us, and he doesn't have to, but he does, reminds us that Judas is what? One of the 12. Judas, one of the 12. One of the apostles comes. And who's with Judas? A crowd. Now, that's interesting, because the crowd is, remember, we've talked about the crowd, the oikos. The oikos has always been in the background, right? They're the ones that are being fed. They're the ones that see the miracles. They're the ones who hear the teachings. They're the ones that the scribes and the Pharisees are afraid of. This oikos. Who is with Judas? The oikos, the high priest. So we've got the crowds with the high priest. The crowds have sort of shifted. They're standing with Judas. They're not standing with Jesus. They're out with Judas. They're not with Jesus. Okay? And how does Judas approach him? What does Judas do? Gives him a kiss. And Jesus said, betraying the Son of Man with a kiss. Now, what happens? What's the reaction of the disciples?
Strike with a sword.
Take a sword. Remember, Jesus has talked about a sword, prior mention. And what happens? Cuts off the ear. Not Peter. That's what it says in John. But this is just the disciples in general. One of them takes a sword and strikes the ear, cuts off the ear of the
Right ear.
the right ear of the chief priest. Okay, servant of the chief priest. How's Jesus? What is his reaction?
Prevent even this.
Okay, he heals him and he says,
No more of that.
why should there be no more? Why should now?
Because his blood is the only thing.
That's right. Well, and he's going to do what? He's praying.
God's will.
God's will. It is God's will. He's already said God's will is what?
Unchangeable.
Yeah, well, God's will is unchangeable, and the will is he's going to be in Jerusalem, he's going to suffer, he's going to die, he's going to be raised, he's going to ascend. That's what he says is God's will. That's got to happen. Now, we got a different presentation as disciples. Because when we read this in the Gospel of Mark, as soon as the crowds come and get him, what do the disciples do in Mark? They scatter. They run away. In the Gospel of Luke, what did the disciples do?
Kind of band together.
They band together. They draw a sword. And if it wasn't for Jesus saying, enough of this, there's no indication in this story that they would have fought. Again, we got Luke, because Luke sees, now, which is right and which is wrong, I don't know. They're telling the story in different ways. The disciples, and particularly the apostles, are going to play an important role in the early church. They're the basis of the early church. Therefore, Luke is not going to portray them here as weak or wishy-washy or instruments of something else. Mark, on the other hand, wants to portray, and I think his intention is, don't worship the apostles. Don't worship the disciples. They weren't much. You're as good as they are. In fact, you may be better. A whole different, using the disciples in a very different way in the Gospel of Mark. But here the disciples I think Luke wants the later church to look up to the disciples because of the role they play in Acts. What do they do? What does a crowd do? What do?
Well, someone seizes
They seize him, right? And they're taking him where?
the high priest.
That can't be good, because the priests are not good. Who's at a distance? Who's following at a distance?
The disciples.
Well, who? Who does it say?
Peter.
is following at a distance. Now, we already know what Peter's going to do, right? Because Jesus has said it. Where is Peter as he's following at a distance?
At a distance, when they
He's following.
had kindled a fire in the middle of the country, or
Okay.
courtyard, and he sat down.
Okay, you got the
But
crowds.
kind of mingling
So
in
he's
with them.
mingling in with the crowds. And what happens to Peter?
That's when he denied.
He denies him 3 times. Even with the denial. Remember, if you look at the same story in Mark, with the denial, Mark says Peter starts cursing at the last one. He starts cussing. We don't have that in Luke. Even the denial is much briefer in Luke than it is in the other, and particularly in Matthew and Mark. It is far briefer. So he denies him 3 times because that's what Jesus said he would do, right? And how does Peter, what happens after the 3rd denial?
He realizes that he did what Jesus said he was going to do.
How does he realize that?
Well, the rooster crowed.
He hears the cock crow.
Here's a cock crow, and then what else? What does it say in,
The Lord
in
turned
51?
and looked.
The Lord looks at him. And that's when Peter, the cock crows, and the Lord looks at him, and what
And
happens?
then he remembered, and he went out and wept.
And wept bitterly. You know, again, when you look at the other Gospels, this betrayal is mixed in with the story. We have the first betrayal and a little bit about Jesus, second one a little bit about Jesus, third more about Jesus. It plays a bigger role in the other Gospels. This is pretty brief, which means Luke is well aware that this happened. This is part of the tradition, but he doesn't want to put too much emphasis on it, because putting too much emphasis on it makes Peter look...
Important.
Well, that's right. By not putting emphasis on, Peter becomes far more important later. You know, so you can say, you know, this was wrong what happened, but remember who was involved in Peter's, in Peter. Satan was involved in what Peter did. So Satan was involved, and even what Peter did isn't quite so bad. I can still respect Peter later, right? Okay, so Peter we're done with that, right? What happens to Jesus? Now, Luke is driving this story, and we see this in all 4 Gospels. This passion story, we're moving fast.
Start beating him.
Okay, they start mocking him and beat him, and specifically, what do?
Blindfold him and ask him if he can
Okay,
tell what he was beaten with.
about
or whatever.
prophesying, and they were insulting him. That's what Jesus said was going to happen. Where is he taken next? So it's like he's checking off a list. Where is he taken after that?
The council.
He's taken to the council, the elders of the people. And Luke wants to remind us that who's there? You got chief priests and scribes, so we know immediately that it is not good. What do they ask him?
Are you the Messiah?
Are you the Messiah, the Christ, the Christus? Okay, why are they asking him that?
They're looking for a reason to kill him.
Okay, they're looking for a reason. Why would they ask him? So they want him to incriminate himself. You know, they want grounds. Now, it's kind of, why would they ask him if he were the Christ, the Messiah, as a way to get him executed? What would, if he said, yeah, I'm the Messiah, yeah, I'm the Christ, how would they interpret?
He thought he was better.
Okay, that he's better. Now remember, the issue here is that Jesus is going to die on a Roman cross. Therefore, for him to die, and we already know that, because we know the tradition, for him to die on a Roman cross, he's got to be viewed as a danger to Rome. Rome could care less whether Jesus is a bad Jew. They don't care. Romans don't care. Romans care
About a threat to their power.
if he's a threat to their power. That's a problem. They would care if he's stirring up people. That would be a problem. But if he's a threat to their power, he's got a big problem. Why would him saying, yeah, you're right, I'm the Christ, why might the Romans see that as a threat to their power?
He would have more power than that.
Okay, and the Messiah, Christus, remember I told you before, one of the things the Jews believe every single king was a Christ. That's what it says in the second Psalm. Because Christus is from the Greek word chrisma, which means to pour. Christus actually means the one on whom something is poured. What is being poured on the Christ? What makes a person a Christus? What makes a king a Christus? How did the Jews? They anointed the kings with what? Oil. They poured oil on the kings. And that's why when you poured oil on the kings, chrisma is the word for pour. When the oil was poured on the king, they became what? Christus. They became Christus, the one on whom oil was poured. If he says, you're right, I am the Messiah, I am the Christus, then he's saying, I am a king, and they can go to the Romans and say, this guy is claiming to be king. That's a political problem. That's a political problem you need to deal with. Not a religious problem. That's a political problem. Okay? Now, we, the reader, because Luke's told us, how has Jesus shown himself to be the Messiah? The Christus. Because remember, Peter said, you are the Christ of God. You are the Messiah of God. How did Luke show us that Jesus proved himself to be the Christ? He did what? He healed. He cast out demons. He did miracles. He fed crowds. That's how Luke says he showed himself to be the Christ. That's not what they're talking about here. So we, the reader, know that they're barking up the wrong tree. Jesus as the Christ is not going to be a political threat. Him healing folks, casting out demons, isn't a political threat. They misunderstand what the Messiah means. What's Jesus' answer?
But if he tells me they would believe him.
Okay.
And then
But
if I ask you who I am.
what does he say? What does he say about? Because there's a title that in the second half, but he's associated not a whole lot, but a little bit. The Son of Man, right? Yeah.
Will not
Won't be seated in the power.
If I question you, you will not answer.
Right. Now,
For now
When-
on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power.
yeah. They're not going to respond, and we already know that because when did Jesus question them? How does he know they're not going to respond if he asks them a question?
He never did before.
They didn't before. Remember when they asked by whose authority? And Jesus says, well, let me ask you a question, and they wouldn't answer. So Luke has already told us that they won't answer his questions. And he talks about the Son of Man coming in power. And what do they immediately say? Now, Son of Man, who is a Son of Man? We've got right now 3 of them in this room. 3 sons of men. And we got 2 daughters of men. Everybody's a son of man. Everybody's a son of man. I mean, that's what we are. how, when he says the Son of Man is going to be, of course he's using that title for himself, points to humanity. They immediately say, are you then
The Son of God.
the Son of God? Has Jesus ever said he's the Son of God?
You
No,
very
he
well
hasn't.
say that I am.
He hasn't. You know, in fact, just then he talked about the Son of Man, which he didn't even necessarily associate with himself, but he said, Son of Man is going to come. And they say, are you the Son of God? And Jesus says,
You say.
you're the one that's using that term, right? And that makes sense because he doesn't say it, and immediately what's their response?
They want further testimony.
We've got all the testimony we needed. We have heard it coming from his lips. But what's the problem?
He didn't.
He didn't say it. It never came from his lips. Which means, why are they convicting him? Remember, why did they hate him initially? You remember when the first
time power.
Okay, remember the first time that Luke says to us, they got together and decided they want to kill him. What had he just done?
Teaching.
Wasn't
What
teaching.
now?
It wasn't teaching. He healed. Who did he heal? You remember who he
The guy
healed?
with
The guy with the
on
withered
the
hand. And
Sabbath.
when did he do it?
Sabbath.
He did it on the Sabbath. And he framed the healing by saying, should you do good or evil on the Sabbath? And they wouldn't answer again. And he said, Sabbath is made for humanity. And he healed. He did good on the Sabbath. That's why they hated him. Why are they convicting him? On something he didn't say. So they're convicting him on a lie. Going to be really important that Jesus is going to go to a cross, because he never claims to be Son of God. He's going to go to a cross, and when the centurion at the cross looks up at him, he's going to say,
Surely
he's an
he was.
innocent man. He's an innocent man. Because he is. He is an innocent man. They're convicting him on something he never said. Based on what he said, but he never said it. It's like convicting somebody for a crime that you got no evidence that they did. And that's what they're doing here. Jesus is going to be truly an innocent man. But we're not at the cross yet, because he's got to appear some other places. And who is he going to appear before? You already know what's going to happen. He's going to have to go to Pontius Pilate. We also, in Luke, he's going to show up in front of Herod Antipas. He's going to show up in front of King Herod, which is unique to Luke, is only in Luke. So he's not at the cross yet, but this council feels they have the charges that they can convict him. They've got the grounds that they can convict him, and convict him in front of the Romans. Because remember, Jesus has got to die on a Roman cross, not under a Jewish stone. Okay? And that's what we'll look at next week. The 23rd chapter. Any questions? This story is being driven. Luke is driving this story fast. We don't have a lot of sitting around waiting. Once this passion story starts, just a softer dealing with the apostles. The apostles don't come off quite so bad. Nobody's running around. Remember in Mark, the guy runs away. Everybody runs away. In fact, one person runs so fast in Mark, they grab his cloak and he runs buck naked because he's so interested in getting away. We don't have the disciples running. Not in Luke. Nor are we going to have Jesus dying alone, which is another one that's, compared to Matthew and Mark, is going to be Luke, is distinct in Luke. He won't be alone because they're going to be there with him. Okay, let's have a word of prayer, and then Coco and I will have some dinner. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together. Remind us that these apostles, these men who have followed Jesus, they're going to be the foundation of the church. And even though they make mistakes, you're going to use them to do great things. So help us claim the examples they offer. Help us to recognize who your son really is. And help us to find comfort and hope in both who he is and what he does. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.